When I rented out a room to a quiet older man, I just wanted a little extra income. But what I didn't expect was that he'd become the one person who made this house feel like home again. And what started as silence between strangers slowly turned into something neither of us were ready for. The house had been too quiet since Eli moved in alone. It creaked at night, sighed during the day, and somehow managed to feel even larger in silence. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy solitude. He thrived in it, in fact, but lately, the stillness had started to feel a bit too heavy. That summer, the decision to rent out the extra room didn't come from financial need as much as from a quiet desire to not be so alone. The ad he posted was simple, just a few lines with a couple of photos. He wasn't expecting much, but then one message stood out. The name was Oliver. The tone of the message was polite, professional, but warm. A week later, Oliver arrived with a few neatly packed bags and a tired smile. He was older, maybe late 30s, with short dark hair streaked lightly with gray at the temples and the kind of calm presence that immediately softened a space. Eli had expected awkwardness, maybe even tension, but none of it came. From the moment Oliver stepped into the house, there was an ease to him. He didn't take up too much space, didn't ask too many questions. He just settled in as if he belonged. There was something oddly comforting about it. The first days passed in quiet coexistence. Eli worked from home, spending most of his hours sketching by the wide living room windows. Oliver often disappeared into town or worked on his laptop at the dining table, occasionally taking calls in a low, steady voice. He wasn't nosy or overly chatty. Yet, somehow, every interaction felt natural, an exchange of small kindnesses, a shared cup of coffee, a nod of recognition in the hallway, the kind of subtle familiarity that builds without effort. Eli noticed himself noticing things. The way Oliver ran a hand through his hair when he was thinking. The way he leaned back in the kitchen chair as he waited for the kettle to boil. The way his laugh, though not often heard, felt genuine and full. It wasn't anything intense or dramatic. It was just there, a quiet awareness building beneath the surface. One evening it rained. Heavy, loud rain that tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. Eli had curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book, the lamp casting a warm pool of light around him. He didn't expect Oliver to appear in the doorway, a fresh cup of tea in each hand. Without a word, he passed one over and sat in the armchair nearby. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than strained. Moments like that became a quiet ritual. Not planned, not discussed, just happened. Sometimes Oliver would sit outside on the porch, and Eli would find himself joining him with no real reason other than wanting to. Sometimes Oliver would comment on Eli's sketches, genuinely curious, not overly flattering, just interested. There was a shift Eli couldn't quite name. A change in atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. His thoughts wandered more often than they used to. He found himself anticipating the sound of Oliver's footsteps or the scent of his aftershave that lingered in the hallway after he passed. These weren't things Eli had felt before. Not in this house. Not with anyone. Oliver never intruded, never crossed any lines. But sometimes Eli caught his gaze lingering a moment longer than usual. Not with discomfort, more like recognition. As if he, too, felt something taking shape between them, fragile and unspoken. Eli tried to reason with himself. He told himself that he was just lonely, that he was reading too much into harmless interactions. But the feelings didn't retreat. If anything, they deepened with each passing day. There was no big moment, no dramatic turning point in those early weeks. Just a steady building of something quiet and real. Eli didn't know what it was or what it meant. But as he stood in the doorway one night, watching Oliver wash dishes in the kitchen under the warm glow of the ceiling light, he felt it settle in his chest, a slow, pulsing awareness that things had begun to change. He wasn't sure where it was going. He wasn't even sure if Oliver noticed it the way he did. But for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel too big. The silence didn't feel heavy. And Eli didn't feel alone. Not anymore. Days folded into each other with a gentle rhythm that Eli hadn't expected. Since Oliver moved in, something had subtly shifted inside the house. It wasn't just the extra footsteps in the hallway or the presence of another mug in the dish rack. It was in the way the house felt, less hollow, more lived in. There was an energy to it now, a warmth that crept into corners once untouched by sunlight. Eli found himself becoming more aware of the small things. He started leaving the kitchen door open when he worked, hoping to hear the soft sound of Oliver typing or humming faintly under his breath. He noticed how Oliver's jackets always hung neatly on the same hook by the door, how his shoes were lined up precisely beneath the bench. It wasn't about obsession. It was attention, quiet and tender. There were conversations, too, light, unforced ones, discussions about books, architecture, the weather. Eli learned that Oliver had worked on several projects across the country, but had taken a break to focus on something personal. He didn't elaborate, and Eli didn't ask. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here now, sharing space in ways that were both ordinary and intimate. On quiet afternoons, Eli would sketch while Oliver read. Sometimes, they'd sit in the same room for hours without saying a word, the silence stretching like a soft thread between them. It was during one of those moments that Eli first realized how much he had come to crave this stillness. Not the lonely kind he had known before, but a shared one. A silence filled with understanding, not absence. The awareness of Oliver grew. Eli's eyes would catch on the curve of his wrist as he reached for a glass, or the way his shirt clung to his back after a warm shower. It wasn't intentional, it just happened. He was drawn to him, not just physically, but emotionally. Oliver seemed grounded, self-assured without being arrogant. He moved through the world like someone who had seen both joy and sorrow and had learned to carry both with grace. One evening, as Eli was finishing a sketch, he heard Oliver's voice behind him. He turned, startled but not unhappy to see him. Oliver gave a small smile and asked what he was drawing. Eli hesitated, unsure whether to share. But Oliver didn't press. Instead, he simply sat nearby, his presence enough of a comfort that Eli continued without further words. After a while, Oliver stood and gently complimented the drawing. There was no condescension in his voice, only quiet sincerity. It was a simple gesture, but it stayed with Eli long after the man had gone to bed. That night, as he lay awake in the low light of his room, he found himself thinking not just about Oliver's words, but about the look in his eyes, soft, proud, and unguarded. The next morning, they had breakfast at the same time. Not planned, but welcome. Eli made coffee, and Oliver toasted some bread. They didn't speak much, yet the silence wasn't awkward. There was a kind of ease in the air, like they were getting used to each other's rhythms. Oliver's hand brushed against Eli's as they reached for the sugar jar at the same time. The touch was brief, but Eli felt it all the way to his chest. A current, subtle, and undeniable. He tried to keep things normal, casual, but the truth was, being near Oliver had started to affect him more than he'd anticipated. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was something deeper, more intimate. A longing he didn't quite know how to name. The moments kept accumulating, small, almost forgettable, if not for the way they made Eli feel. The time they stood side by side on the porch during a quiet rain, each holding a cup of tea. The way Oliver laughed at a silly joke Eli made, his head tilting back, his eyes full of light. The morning Oliver handed him a folded note, a recommendation for a graphic novel he thought Eli would enjoy. It wasn't just thoughtfulness. It was attention, and it felt personal. One afternoon, Eli found himself standing in the hallway, watching Oliver assemble a small table for the guest room. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, and his forearms tensed as he turned a screwdriver. Eli knew he should walk away, go back to work, focus on anything else, but he couldn't. Not when the sight made his breath hitch and his pulse race. He didn't understand it fully. He only knew that the world seemed a little softer when Oliver was around. His laughter echoed in Eli's mind long after the sound had faded. His scent lingered in shared spaces, and even when they were apart, something about the house still felt filled with his presence. Eli wasn't sure what this was or where it would go, but he knew this. Oliver had brought a kind of light into his life that hadn't been there before. It was quiet, gentle, and unassuming, but it was real. And day by day, Eli found himself leaning toward that light, hoping it might someday lean back. It was an ordinary evening when the storm rolled in, sudden, wild, and heavy with summer heat. The sky turned charcoal gray, and the wind began to rattle the trees in the backyard. Eli stood at the window, watching the first flashes of lightning stretch across the sky like cracks in the atmosphere. The rain came next, thick, steady, drumming against the glass with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. He'd always found storms oddly comforting. There was something honest about them, something cleansing. But this one brought more than rain. A loud crack of thunder echoed overhead, and just as Eli reached to turn on the hallway light, the house went dark. The power outage was total. Not just a flicker, but complete silence. The hum of the refrigerator gone, the ceiling fan stilled, even the soft glow of Eli's phone charger disappeared. The house, so familiar in the daylight, took on a different shape in the dark. Every shadow stretched longer. Every sound, like the creak of floorboards, grew louder. Eli took a breath, letting the silence settle over him. He moved carefully through the house, gathering candles from drawers and lighting them one by one. The soft glow filled the rooms with a warm, flickering light that painted the walls in amber tones. It felt old-fashioned, almost romantic, though he tried not to linger on the word. Oliver appeared a few minutes later, barefoot and holding a flashlight. His hair was slightly tousled, his expression calm. He looked around and then offered a small smile. Without speaking, he joined Eli in lighting a few more candles and setting them across the kitchen table. They sat across from each other, two silhouettes in a quiet world, lit only by firelight. The air felt thicker than usual, charged, somehow. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was something else entirely. Eli wrapped his fingers around a mug of tea, the warmth grounding him. Across the table, Oliver leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, relaxed but present. The light from the candle flickered in his eyes, casting shifting shadows over the angles of his face. Eli tried not to stare, but it was difficult. In that lighting, everything about Oliver seemed softer, more open. A silence stretched between them, not awkward but layered. Eli felt it like a tide rising inside him. He wanted to say something, to ask a question or share a thought, but the words caught somewhere deep in his throat. It was Oliver who finally broke the quiet. He asked Eli about his art, how he'd started, what inspired him. The question was simple, but the way he asked it made it feel more than casual. Eli answered carefully at first. Then, with growing confidence, his voice gaining weight as he described how drawing helped him process the world, how he often felt more honest on paper than he did in conversation. Oliver listened, not just with his ears, but with his entire presence. He didn't interrupt or offer quick comments. He just let the moment unfold. And for Eli, that was rare. He wasn't used to being seen like that, with attention that wasn't rushed or distracted. As the wind howled outside and rain hammered against the roof, the inside of the house felt like a small island, cut off from everything, safe in its stillness. Time moved differently under candlelight. The evening stretched out, unmeasured by clocks or screens. They talked about places they'd been, things they'd lost, dreams that still felt just out of reach. Eli was surprised by how much he shared, how easy it felt. It wasn't planned, but something about the night, about Oliver, made honesty feel less risky. When the candles burned low and their mugs sat empty, they moved to the living room, where the windows offered a view of the storm still rumbling through the dark. They sat side by side on the couch, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the heat radiating between them. Eli couldn't remember the last time he had felt so present, so grounded in a moment. There was no rush, no performance, just quiet proximity and a sense of being understood. The silence between them shifted again, this time filled with something unspoken but undeniable. It sat between them, soft but persistent, like a question neither of them was ready to ask. Eventually, Oliver stood and stretched, his movements slow and unhurried. He looked at Eli, a faint smile on his lips, then nodded toward the hallway, an unspoken goodnight. Eli nodded in return, though part of him wanted to say something more. Instead, he watched as Oliver disappeared down the hall, his footsteps fading into the distance. Later, alone in bed, Eli lay awake, the rain still falling outside. The storm had passed, but something had changed. The power outage had turned the house into a cocoon, stripping away the distractions and noise that so often filled their days. What was left was something quieter, deeper. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew he would remember that night. The glow of the candles, the shared stories, the steady rhythm of Oliver's voice, long after the lights came back on. The morning after the storm was calm, almost eerily so. The clouds had cleared, leaving behind a damp hush in the air, the kind that lingered on the grass and rooftops like a memory. Sunlight filtered through the windows in soft golden streaks, stretching across the floor like silk. Eli woke slowly, the weight of the previous night still sitting gently in his chest. There had been no dramatic moment, no revelation or confession, only a kind of stillness that had said more than words ever could. It stayed with him, curling into the corners of his thoughts as he padded barefoot into the kitchen. Oliver was already there, dressed simply, sipping coffee and reading something on his tablet. He looked up as Eli entered, offered a small nod and a smile, then returned to his screen. The quiet between them had changed, though. It wasn't awkward or strained, but there was a new awareness in it, as if something fragile and unspoken now hung between every glance and movement. They moved through the morning with unspoken coordination. Eli made toast. Oliver refilled the kettle. Their elbows brushed once, briefly, and neither said anything, but the contact lingered. The silence felt charged, like the moment before a question is asked. Later, Eli retreated to his room to work, but found himself distracted. His sketches lacked focus, his lines hesitant and unsure. He couldn't stop replaying the way Oliver had listened to him the night before, how fully he had been there, how effortlessly seen Eli had felt. It was rare, maybe the rarest thing he'd ever known. By afternoon, the air had turned warmer, the remnants of the storm fading into blue skies and birdsong. Eli stood in the doorway that led to the backyard, a mug in hand, watching the garden sway in the breeze. He wasn't expecting to hear footsteps behind him, but when he turned, Oliver was there. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside Eli, taking in the view. There was something heavy in his stillness, a kind of thoughtful pause that made Eli's pulse quicken. Eventually, Oliver said something about how calm everything felt, about how rare it was to experience silence that didn't feel empty. Eli nodded. He knew exactly what he meant. The conversation drifted naturally, but there was an edge to it now. A searching tone beneath Oliver's words. A sense that he was trying to feel out something unsaid. Eli felt it too, and the anticipation of it tightened his chest. When Oliver finally turned to look at him, really look at him, Eli met his gaze and held it. Something passed between them, too fleeting to name, but too strong to ignore. Oliver spoke again, softer now, choosing his words with care. He mentioned how different things felt lately. How, at some point, the lines between tenant and host, stranger and friend, had blurred. How he wasn't sure what it meant, only that it meant something. Eli felt a flicker of relief. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't the only one holding these quiet, aching thoughts. He nodded slowly, his voice barely audible as he admitted that yes, he noticed it too. The weight of that shared truth settled over them. Not heavy, but undeniable. They didn't touch. They didn't move closer. But the space between them seemed to breathe differently after that. The air felt warmer, more honest. Neither one of them tried to define what was happening, but neither one turned away from it. That night, the house felt quieter again, but not in the old way. It was a different kind of quiet, one filled with anticipation, with the steady beat of something beginning. Eli lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind echoing with Oliver's voice, his words, his expression when he'd spoken them. He thought about everything that had led them here. The moments that had seemed so small at the time, but now felt monumental. The cups of tea, the silent dinners, the night of the storm. All of it had been building to this quiet recognition. He didn't know where it would lead. He wasn't even sure if anything would come of it. But the idea that someone like Oliver, thoughtful, grounded, and quietly magnetic. Might feel something too was enough. For the first time in a long time, Eli let himself hope. Not for a grand romance or a dramatic revelation. Just for more mornings like this. More shared silences. More warmth. He closed his eyes, the image of Oliver standing beside him still clear in his mind. Not touching, not speaking, but present. And sometimes, presence is the most powerful thing of all. The days that followed their quiet confession unfolded with a kind of careful grace. Nothing changed in any obvious way. There were no sudden declarations, no grand gestures, but beneath the surface, everything felt different. It was in a way they moved around each other, no longer tiptoeing, but drifting closer. It was in the lingering glances, the shared silences, and the unspoken permission to simply be seen. Eli found himself settling into this new rhythm with quiet awe. He and Oliver still kept to their routines. Work, meals, quiet evenings, but now, those moments carried a gentle awareness. When they passed each other in the hall, their shoulders might brush, and neither would flinch. When they sat in the same room, the space between them would close just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to feel the difference. One evening, Eli stood at the kitchen sink, washing a few dishes when Oliver came in. He didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against the counter and watched, his expression unreadable but calm. The moment stretched in comfortable silence until Oliver reached for a towel and started drying. Eli said thank you without looking up, but the corners of his mouth betrayed the warmth that bubbled beneath. Later, they sat on the back porch as the sky shifted from gold to indigo. The evening air was cool, but not cold, and the fading light made the garden look softer, more dreamlike. Oliver sipped from a cup of tea, while Eli let his sketchbook rest on his knees, untouched. There were no words exchanged, but none were needed. In that moment, the quiet between them felt like a conversation in itself. It wasn't love, not yet. Love takes time, and they had only just begun to understand each other. But it was something real, a connection built not on drama or urgency, but on attention, on presence, on the decision to stay. The turning point came in a moment that, to anyone else, might have seemed ordinary. It was late, and Eli couldn't sleep. He found himself in the kitchen again, the only light coming from above the stove. He poured a glass of water, stood there for a while, then turned to head back to his room. That's when he saw Oliver, sitting in the armchair, legs crossed, a book in hand. They exchanged a glance, something quiet passing between them. Eli didn't go back to his room. Instead, he sat down on the couch across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Oliver closed his book and leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't say anything earth-shattering, just that he was glad to be here, that this house, this unexpected place, had become something of a sanctuary. Eli felt his chest tighten, not from sadness, but from the strange ache of recognition. He felt the same. They didn't move closer that night. There was no need. The space between them had already changed. It was no longer filled with tension or questions. It was filled with quiet understanding, the kind that grows between two people who've learned to listen. As the days turned into weeks, the warmth between them deepened. They shared more meals, more soft evenings, more unspoken moments. Eli began to draw again with intention, and Oliver often sat nearby, occasionally glancing over with a faint smile. It felt natural, unforced, as if the house itself had begun to breathe more easily. There were moments of uncertainty, of course. Days when the silence felt heavier, when doubt crept in. But they always returned to each other, not with words, but with presence. And that presence, steady and consistent, was the most reassuring thing of all. One morning, as the first leaves began to turn with the approach of autumn, Eli stood at the front door, watching the sun rise. Oliver joined him, hands tucked into his sweater sleeves, his eyes tracing the horizon. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Standing side by side, they both knew this was no longer about renting a room. It was about something more, something they hadn't planned for, but welcomed all the same. Eli thought back to the beginning, to the silence that once filled the house like a weight. Now, that silence had become a space for growth, for quiet joy, for something that felt like the start of belonging. He turned to Oliver, just briefly, and when their eyes met, it wasn't with confusion or hesitation. It was with the quiet certainty of two people who had chosen, moment by moment, to trust the slow unfolding of something real. Whatever came next, they would figure it out together. And that was enough.